Hello and welcome to the Introduction to Beekeeping Equipment. This video is part of the Beginner Beekeeper Series produced between Spencer, Bullitt, and Oldham counties in the greater Louisville, Kentucky area. I am your presenter for this section. I am Jake Barker, EAS and Cornell Master Beekeeper. I've been keeping bees 7 or 8 years, and I have about 100 hives currently. We do honey production and queen production and are non-migratory. We have several bee yards as well. When it comes to teaching beekeeping equipment, ideally you do this in person to where you can pick up the stuff and look at it. We realize that's not an option for everyone, be it distance, work schedules, snowstorms, all those other things that keep us from going to actual meetings in person. So I'll do the best I can to showcase as much equipment as I can. With an hour, we can cover most of the common stuff, but we can't really show everything. There's just too much to it. One of the best things you can do is get catalogs from some of the major producers such as Dadant or MannLake Limited and go through those catalogs and see what all equipment is out there and realize there's far more suppliers than just those big names. Now I'll switch back to screen share and we'll start drilling through these slides. Okay, there we go. Intro to bee equipment. This is going to be a basic overview. Like I said, I only have an hour. I can only show so much different variations on equipment, but we can cover all the basic stuff pretty well. We need to cover the hive, beekeeper tools, and PPE. That's personal protective equipment. That'll be your bee jacket, your gloves. Now the hive, before we even dive into this thing, and this is a common setup in our region, we need to know a couple basic terms. One is movable frames. Movable frames is what sets apart the modern hive from prior variants. Like in the olden times, we had skep hives and log hives. Well, in a lot of those, you couldn't open it up and remove the individual frames, the individual sheaves of wax to see what was going on in the hive. It also meant to harvest the hive, you had to kill off the bees in that hive. Very destructive way to do things. And what made movable frames possible is the discovery of bee space. Lorenzo Langstroth is actually the guy who figured out bee space, and that's why we call our hives Langstroth style hives, these large square structures, even though his hive didn't look anything like this. Bee space. Bee space is the area bees have to work with. Now, if you give bees a 1/4 inch of space or less, they'll fill it up with a gum called propolis. It's tree waxes and resins. If you give them more than 3/8 inches of space, they build comb. If they have a big space, they'll build nice big honeycombs. If they have a little space, they'll fill it with what we call burr comb, these little erratic comb structures, just to fill up that void. Ideally, we give them to a 1/4 inch to a 3/8 inch of space. That's what we call bee space. That's the space they will maintain for hallways and corridors. And that's what we use to great success in the Langstroth style hives and other modern style hives. Brood chamber, that's something you'll see commonly stated, but no one will say what it is. Brood chamber is where the bee nest is, where they actually raise their young, where they do all the bee house kind of stuff. It's usually going to be darker comb. It's usually going to be towards the bottom of the hive or close to the entrance on the bottom of the hive. There's also super and nadir. Super just means put something on top. Nadir means put something below. When we talk about these white boxes on this hive, these are commonly referred to as supers. Let me see if I can turn a highlighter on. There we go, laser pointer. These boxes up top are commonly referred to as supers because they go on top of the brood nest, which in this box will be, in this hive will be down here. Nadiring is something you'll do if you use a Warre hive, where instead of putting boxes on top, you put boxes underneath the brood nest. Two totally different methodologies. Admittedly, you won't see much of the latter one around here. Now this is a Langstroth hive. This is also known as a Kentucky hive if you have the old Kelly Beekeeping catalogs. And to go through the parts in order, we have the top, which is a telescope top. That means it sits over and crowns down kind of like a hat on top of the hive to keep the rain out. Underneath this, without being able to be seen, is an inner cover. And beneath that, we have 3 mediums. These are called mediums because of how tall they are. And they're called 10 frame mediums because of how wide they are. They're wide enough to hold 10 frames. Underneath these 3, we have 2 deep boxes. These are most commonly used for brood nests around here. A deep box is going to be 9 5/8 inches tall, while those mediums are 6 5/8 or so. And these are also 10 frames wide, and they're going to have frames and foundation. Frames are the wooden things that hold the wax sheets, and the foundation is that wax sheet that we install in there to convince bees to build it the way we want them to. Lastly, at the bottom is the bottom board down here. This one also has a entrance reducer on it. That's the thing that blocks this bottom space. We also have a big ratchet strap on this thing to make sure this hive doesn't get blown over by a strong windstorm, because this thing is pretty tall and up in the air. Now, when it comes to beekeeping equipment, there's a lot of things we could get into with the boxes. There's the materials. Most of them are made of wood. The boxes we just looked at were probably all pine, if I recall correctly. Some of it might have been cypress. You'll see cedar on occasion as well. There's also plastic hives, and these aren't terribly common in our region. They can be just plain old polystyrene, regular old styrofoam, looks like a big beer cooler out there. And they can also be cased, where they'll take that polystyrene and cover it in a harder plastic to make it more robust. And these are generally very expensive hives when they're that cased style, but they have a lot better insulation than wood hives do. With the wood hives, we also talk about joint types: finger, rabbet, and butt, fasteners, box widths, and box depths. Let's take a second to look at the box widths and depths on the right side of the screen. There are all sorts of different variations. The one thing that's common with Langstroth style hives is how deep, how long they are, how far they go front to back. And they're almost always 20 inches long. And that's to accommodate the common Langstroth style frame length. Now that said, they can be all different heights and all different widths. The widths determines how many frames they can hold. A 10 frame hive is 16 1/4 wide, 8 frame hive, 13 1/4. Nukes are 5 framers, generally speaking, and they're 9 1/4 wide. But there's all sorts of other sizes in between. We have 7 frame hives, 6 frame hives, and 4 frame hives. Believe it or not, these 6 frame and 4 frame are becoming more popular. 4 frames you can stack side by side on top of a 10 frame hive. So some people like to use certain tricks to actually set up 2 different hives in a single box. These 6 frames are actually common with these styrofoam style hives. Now there's also box depths, and there's even more variation here. Like I said, a deep, that's going to be the most common size used for a brood box, is 9 5/8 inches. Mediums are 3 inches shorter. Shallows are even smaller, but just smaller enough to make it confusing if you have mediums or shallows. And then you have all sorts of other oddball stuff. There's eeks and rims. These are usually like 2 inch tall or 3 inch tall salvage pieces of hive that we use for feeding in the wintertime. And there's also comb hive and Ross round setups, or even other sizes as well. You're not going to encounter these as a beginner, generally speaking. As a beginner, if you buy a kit hive, you're going to probably end up with deeps and mediums. Those are just the most common sizes in either 10 frame or 8 frame. It's becoming increasingly popular to actually do all mediums in all 8 frames because it's lighter. When you mess with these boxes, you have to realize these were standardized in the 1800s, and they were okay with making people lift 90-pound boxes by themselves, stooped over. That wasn't that abnormal to them. To us, it seems totally alien. But if you switch to those 8 frame mediums, your box weights get closer to 50 pounds at maximum. It's a lot more manageable for most people. Box materials and preparations. As I said, they're mostly going to be made of wood. These are actually going to be cypress ones in this picture here. This is my loadout maybe 3 or 4 years ago. These were from Pete Zook, and Zook is a Amish manufacturer near Bowling Green, Kentucky. And you can see I painted them. I paint these with great intent. Bees see in a color range of orange to ultraviolet. they don't see the color red. So you'll notice I don't have any red painted boxes, but I do have yellow, orange, blue, and purple. I also have green hives, which I don't have in this picture. This is just a high quality exterior paint on these boxes. It helps protect them, even though they're cypress in this instance. This is not hardwood, so the stuff is still prone to rotting. You're always better off painting equipment to stretch its life. You'll also notice the paint goes to the underside of the boxes, but doesn't cover the interior. You want the interior to be bare wood because bees will interact with that surface quite a bit. You don't want them chewing paint off inside the hive where you're trying to raise a honey crop. What else is worth noting in this picture? Nothing comes to mind. Let's keep going and see what else we find. Now we need to talk about wood box joint types. Like I said, there's going to be 3 basic styles of joinery: butt, rabbet, and finger. Let's start with finger because finger is the best one. Finger is the bottom right, where we have this strange edge on the corner here, where it kind of has this crenellation like a rook. What that is the boards are cut with fingers that interlock, and that is a very strong joint. And we have fasteners that go from the front back and from the side in down here. And that just creates a great amount of strength. This is usually considered your best box joint style right here, and will be the most common one you encounter. An acceptable alternative is the rabbet joint here. With a rabbet joint, one of the boards is half milled out to accept the other board. And what that means is we can have fasteners that go from the front in and from the side in. We still have crisscross fasteners that give us the greatest strength possible. It's that crisscrossing of fasteners that gives great strength to both the finger and the rabbet joint, because for that joint to move, not only do some fasteners have to pull out, other fasteners have to shear. And in shear, fasteners are at their greatest strength. So that makes this a very strong joint. Now, this is at the opposite of the top right of the screen. This is a butt joint, where just one side slaps up to another side. That means we can only have fasteners going from this side in. So we, just from the start, have only half the fasteners that the other joints have. And this is a very weak joint. Now, a lot of people will build these boxes with wood glues, and that does help a lot. But again, a butt joint is just an inherently weaker joint. If you do use wood glue in assembling your boxes, you want to use a weatherproof, food-safe product. And that's going to be Titebond 3 in most cases. Titebond 3 is going to be in the green jar in the hardware store. And that's rated for incidental food contact. It's the one you want to use. Now, box fasteners. There's all sorts of different ways to assemble your boxes. Like I said, you can use glues, and glues are generally recommended. I actually don't use them myself just because I assemble so many boxes, and we'll get into how I assemble those. Historically, the box would be assembled with what's called a 7-penny box nail. And that's this little thing here. That's a 7, well, this is actually an 8-penny box nail because they don't have any 7 pennies. And if you're in the hardware store, you're probably going to find 8-penny nails. An 8-penny nail is 2 3/8 inches long. A 7-penny is 2 1/8 inches long. And we should emphasize what a box nail means. This is actually a skinny nail. If we take this to next to a standard 10-penny nail, the standard framing nail, you can see that framing nail is a lot wider than the box nail. The reason why they use a box nail and why they're used with boxes is when you're nailing on the ends of a board, they have a tendency to split. If you use a skinnier nail, you'll still get good contact and adhesion, but be less likely to split the wood. Now, a lot of people aren't a fan of slapping nails into a box because you have to use a hammer. And let's be frank, not all of us are good with a hammer anymore. On a different note, this is also a 2-inch electro-galvanized roofing nail, and that's also an acceptable alternative if need be. I've used these before too for fixing stuff in the field. But not everyone's thrilled to use a hammer. That means a lot of people use a screw. This is a option here. This is a 2-inch wood screw. It's probably a number 8. And it's got a little Phillips head on it, so you can use a standard Phillips head driver to shoot these in. One of the downsides with this is a rather thick screw. It has this trumpet head. And I found without pre-drilling the boxes, this tends to split your wood. Pine isn't too terrible about splitting. Cypress is worse. Cedar is terrible. You really need to pre-drill if you're using cedar boxes, especially if you're using screws or large nails for that matter. There are higher end screws like this thing. This is a Grick screw. That's just a brand name. But it's got what I call a truss head. It's got this flat head that kind of acts as a washer, much less likely to split your wood and gives a really strong connection. But also, this is an expensive screw. So what do the manufacturers use and what do I use? Generally, in large box production, and by large, I mean numbers, making hundreds of boxes, you're going to encounter staples. Now, there's two different sizes of staple in general to talk about, and these are the ones I use. This is a 2-inch medium crown staple that has a lot of holding power. These don't split the wood much at all. And again, it's a big fastener. Now, one of the downsides with that is you have to have one of these. And this is an expensive and relatively uncommon staple gun to shoot these fasteners. So generally, you'll only see these with people with large scale operations. The good news is these put the box together in no time. On an aside, we have videos of me assembling boxes, and we'll put links to that in the comments below, so you can find that stuff and see how I actually do these boxes in my garage, in my workshop. Now, a caveat: some manufacturers sell staple boxes, but they use a smaller staple. They use a 1/4 inch by 1.5 staple. Now, the downside is this staple really doesn't go deep enough into the boxes to hold them together, in my opinion. These tend to have their boxes splay apart and split. I'm not a fan of using these for box assembly. The 2-inchers do a pretty good job holding things together. That said, I've seen people use these to put boxes together and then put these screws in the corners. And that seems to work pretty well. It seems to be a decent hybrid option. Let's get back to the video, or the slides rather. Give it a second to load. There we are. Moving along. Okay, box width. We talk about all sorts of different sizes of box widths. We also have different box heights in this picture. On the left, this little box over here, that's a 5-frame nuke. Over here, this is a 10-frame hive. You'll notice it's roughly twice as big as this 5-frame nuke is. On the right picture, this is an 8-frame hive next to a 10-frame hive. Again, you can see this is just a little skinnier than this one is. Again, different options for different pros and cons. The 5-frame hive weighs substantially less than a 10-frame, a little more than half the weight. An 8-frame hive still cuts out about 20 pounds when full compared to a 10-frame hive. Again, dealing with weight, dealing with sizes. Now, box depths, looking at box depths. On the right side, we have 3 deeps, which are 9 5/8 tall. And on top of that, we have an eek. This is a piece of box that was cut down, a rotten box that I took through a table saw. And it's probably about 2.5 inches high. And I use this for feeding dry sugar in the wintertime. See, there's newspapers sticking out of the edges. You'll learn about that with feeding with Leonard later on. And box depths again, here we have that classic Kentucky setup of deep, deep, medium, medium, medium. You'll notice this box is actually sitting on cinder blocks, but it's just sinking into the earth below it. The deeps are set up on the bottom as broods, and the mediums are on top as honey supers. That's for honey collection on top. I also have a top bar hive in the background of that shot. Just notice that. Now, what are some popular alternative arrangements? There's the all medium, like I said earlier, where we just take a bunch of medium boxes instead of using those deeps because they're inherently lighter to move. Now we're going to move on to frames. Time to get deep in the weeds on frames. Again, we can talk about the materials, wood versus plastic. There's different frame depths to meet up with the different depths of boxes. There's different styles of foundation, again, different fasteners. There's also different frame styles that we'll see pictures of and try to explain. Now, frame materials, this is solid plastic frames. The nice thing about this is you can buy them from the manufacturer and they're done and ready to go. There's nothing else for you to do. There are a couple downsides to them though. One is they have all these little reinforcing gussets and trusses that have all these hollow spaces they end up creating. And the problem with these hollow spaces is these turn into spots for pests to hang out in. So they can kind of give you a bit of an issue with things like small hive beetle and stuff like that, that you'll learn about later. Another downside is these are much more flexible than a wood wrapped frame. These will actually bend and bow like a saw blade when you take them out of the hive. Realize when this thing's full of honey, it's going to weigh about 10 pounds. So when you're moving it, it's going to kind of flip and flop on you, which I really don't care for, because each time it flips and flops, you're breaking cells and causing leaks or storing brood. Conversely, here we have some wood wrapped frames, and these are what I prefer. I actually almost exclusively use wood wrapped plastic foundation at this point. Now, this thing here, this is actually a wired wax foundation. Now, one of the downsides with wired wax, and I think let me skip ahead for a second. Yeah, we'll come back to that, is that it can be very involved to install. Now, frame depths, this one here on top, this is a shallow. This is going to be your 5 and 11/16 inch tall frame. One of the things about shallows is they don't sell plastic foundation for them. So they're almost entirely set up with wired wax, which is what you see here. This frame beneath it, this is going to be a medium. That's your 6 5/8 inch tall frame. And lastly, we have a deep on the very bottom. And you can see that thing's 3 inches taller than that medium at 9 5/8 inches. Actually, it's not 9 5/8. I'm lying to you. These are slightly shorter. Hello, furball. Because they have to fit inside of a box and have bee space still on one side or the other. A deep frame, even though it goes in a 9 5/8 inch tall box, is 9 1/8 inch tall. A medium frame going in a 6 5/8 box is 9 1/4 inches tall. They're a little bit shorter. So I misspoke saying how tall they were. The frames are a little bit shorter than the boxes they go into. Moving on. Different foundation types. We have wax, we have white plastic, and we have black plastic. Again, wax is troublesome because you have to spend a lot more time putting it together. When you look at the videos of me assembling frames, which again we'll have a link for, this wax, you need to install these wires in the frame, and then you install the wax in the frame, and then you need to embed the wires into the wax. If you don't do this, when you go to extract the honey out of this frame, the wax will fly right out and destroy itself. And we really want to salvage that wax for as many uses as we can. Conversely, we have this white plastic here. And the nice thing is these plastic frames, you can spin the holy heck out of them and they tend not to blow apart. They are pretty robust. I like to use the white plastics for honey supers because you can somewhat type your honey in the frame. We have a big locust flow in the spring here, and it creates a water white honey, a really light colored honey. And I like to separate that from my other flow where I can because it has a very unique flavor that I enjoy. On the right, we have black plastic foundation. And I think this is a world beater for brood nests because in the brood nest, this black plastic makes it really easy to spot eggs. So even if your eyes are a little dodgy, this really helps you see those eggs in the bottom of these cells. We also have foundationless frames. There used to be a frame from Kelly's that was just a wedge on the top that the bees would theoretically build their wax off of. This is a piece of foundation wax stapled into a wax style frame. And the idea is the bees will festoon and build off of that. This one doesn't have wires. They can be made with wires. The problem with foundation is it can be hard to convince the bees to build it correctly, and most beekeepers in our region do not do it. If you look at this box on the right, you can see what happens when the bees don't listen and they do their own thing. And all that wax is going to have to come out because you're not going to be able to get that box apart and salvage it otherwise. Now, frame fasteners. let's go back to the live video and y'all can see me. There's two different sets of options for assembling frames when you get down to it. Nails and staples. Most people start out, they don't have staple guns and stuff, so they're going to use hammer and nails. The nails they give you for these frames are pretty small and pretty fidgety. You can see that's the big nail. And they're just little wire nails. And if you're doing wax, you're going to get short nails like this for what's called a wedge bar. And we'll see what a wedge bar looks like in a little bit. This is a really fiddly way to put frames together because you're assembling wood that barely holds on to itself. And I have one here, an older frame that was put together with nails, and I will show you how the nails go on. On the bottom, is this even visible? Barely visible, there we go. On the bottom, we have a nail here and here that go into this end piece to hold the bottom on. On the top, we have one nail that comes in from the top, and we have another nail, let's see if we can get the light to work with this, that comes in from the side. And that puts one of those fasteners into shear and one fastener into pull out. So this is a fairly strong joint. The one at the bottom is fairly weak. If you nail frames together, you really want to use glue because these are going to be really floppy after you assemble. They're still going to have a lot of bend and give to them. And also, this is a wired frame. And let's see if I can spot it. The wires are nailed together here with a little short nail. And then the wires actually have to get tension with a bender that puts this flex in it and gives them that much tautness. You really need tight wires when you're doing wax. I use this as a foundationless frame. Now, the other option is putting together frames with one of these things. Again, this requires buying a staple gun and having an air compressor, which not everyone has. But this is substantially faster. When you watch the videos, you really see how much faster these staples go. I generally would use a 1 1/4 inch staple to assemble my frames. And the frames are a little bit faster because we don't nail from different sides. We'll put 2 in from the bottom and we just do 2 from the top. Or if we have a miss, we'll do 3 from the top. The reason why we don't bother doing the side one is you really can't get the staple gun in there. There's not really enough room to get it in there. The nice thing is these little staples, when you shoot them in with the gun, they tend to get slightly deformed. They don't go straight in. They tend to go in and bend a little or curlicue a little. And that means for that fastener to come back out, you also have to bend it back straight, and that takes a good deal of force. Even though this isn't glued together, I can't pull this apart. These are just staples in here. And by skipping that glue step, we're also saving time on the assembly. I don't know if we'll get to show it in the slides, but here's a different frame altogether. When I show a picture of a top bar hive, this is all the frame that you have in a top bar hive. It's just a wooden bar. This is a 1 3/8 inch wide bar with a little triangle piece of 1x wood stapled on it. And that's all it is. This has 8 staples in it. Actually, the modern ones I just do 4 right from the top down. And that's all you need for a top bar frame. Oh, I need to go back to the video feed or the slideshow rather. 1 second for that to load up. Now, talking about wax foundation, because it takes some time to do wax right. Again, you'll see 2 different ways the wax is actually attached to the top bar. The top bar of a frame is this one that's on the top up here. Now this one here used staples. This is a regular old staple from a staple gun, probably a 3/8 inch staple that clunks on the wire. That sort of works. It's fast. But the problem is if you don't do every wire, they'll start to bend and deform on you, and it gets kind of sloppy kind of fast. The other option is using what's called a wedge. And when you buy frames for wax, you'll get what's called a wedge top bar. And they have this piece of wood. This is obviously a replacement piece of wood because this is an old frame that I recycled. And what that piece of wood does is it kind of clamps against those wire tails to hold that sheet in place at the top. I find the wedge to be a vast improvement over the staple for putting these together, even though this takes a little more time. We also need to talk about the bottoms of these things. This is a groove bottom, and this is a split bottom. And for wax, I find split bottom superior because the wax will free hang here. It doesn't have anything that stops it. This one here, you can sometimes end up with the wax running a little longer, and it kind of stands on top of this groove. There's a groove cut in this bar. It's not really visible. But it has a little, the bar's a U shape when you get down to it. Sometimes it doesn't sit in there well and gets a little deformity to it. I like this one because it allows the wax to hang with gravity, and you tend to get better frames with it. Now, moving beyond frames, it's time to talk about other equipment: lids, inner covers, and migratory tops. The more common setup is the telescope top with inner cover. With that, you have the telescope top. And again, this goes on the hive like a hat. It goes over and down on the sides. And the nice thing about this is when rain hits this thing, it directs rain away from the boxes. These boxes are expensive, so if we can keep rain from sitting on them, we want to. And that's what the telescoping top does. Now, a problem with the telescope top is if we put this straight on the hive, if bees build stuff onto this top, we can't crack it and slice it. We end up stuck. So that's why we have the inner cover. The inner cover goes beneath the telescope top and has a flat bottom or a rim bottom. This is the rim on this one that allows you as a beekeeper to pop that off. And if the bees have built to it, you can take your tool in there and cut it free. Very rarely do you have to do that, but that's part of why that assembly is the way it is. On the right, we have what's called a migratory top. And this replaces both pieces on the left. So this is an inherently cheaper option. Downsides though is this side here sits right on the box lip. So rain hits this thing, can't run off the edges because there's this raised end that clamps onto the hive. So you're sending rain onto the side of the box, which is going to promote rot ultimately. You'll see this used frequently in commercial operations because their boxes are so shoved together, they don't have room for these sides sticking off. A lot of people also drill a hole in these to place feeders right through the lid onto the hive. I am not a fan of migratory tops. I don't use them, but they're out there. We also need to talk about bottom boards and closed versus open bottom boards and different styles. On the left is going to be the more common style of screen bottom board and really the more common style of bottom board in use in our region. It's a simple design with just some, what we call that, dado cut rails. So it's flat. The older style you'll see are these, which have this raised lip and assembly on them. I'm not a fan of these. All this woodwork just adds cost, and you know the mice love to have this place to hang out underneath the hive. We really don't want to encourage that. So I really prefer this style on the left. Now, most of these ones will have the ability to also slide in what's called an IPM board, the sheet of plastic here. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. It's part of your varroa control that Leonard will talk about. But you can slide this in on the underside of this screen space to make it closed off, which a lot of us like to do in wintertime. So in the summertime, we'll take that board out, give the bees a lot of airflow through this screen. In the wintertime, we'll slide the board in, reduces the airflow, helps them maintain temperature in the hive. We also have this thing in the front here. This is a reducer. What a reducer does is takes this big 3/4 inch by 16-inch space, probably 15-inch space here, and makes it more like a 2-inch space. When you have this great big space, that's a big area for the bees to defend. But if we give them this littler opening here, there's still plenty of room for their foragers to come and go, and it's a lot easier to defend. I know some people that have made galley style entrances where they'll actually make a board that's 3 inches long and they'll cut a rabbit cut through it that's that size. So they actually have a hallway style entrance, which the bees can defend even more so. On the right, this bottom board actually still has what's called a mouse guard installed on it. What a mouse guard is, this gets installed in front of the opening on the hive. So there's probably a reducer like this had the opening right here. And that keeps mice from entering the hive. In the wintertime, really once temperatures go below 55 degrees, the bees cannot defend their hive from mammals. So mice and shrews can get in there set up a nest, eat brood, cause all sorts of chaos. The way we prevent that is installing mouse guards, and that's what this is here. And it's still stapled to the bottom board that I had it on. So that's why that looks like that. This is my storage shed here. You can see all my stuff hanging out in it. Now, closed bottom boards versus open. This here is obviously a closed or a solid bottom board. This is a screened one. And these are for 5-frame nukes, these ones are. And one of the downsides with a solid bottom board is they tend to accrue trash and mold and mildew. And I'm just not a fan of that. They also limit how much airflow you can introduce into a hive. Like this box here, or rather this bottom board, it has a fixed entrance reducer to where they only have a 3/4 inch airspace. So when you have a nuke sitting on this, there's going to be a lot of bees on the front during the summertime because of how hot it gets inside. Feeders. One of the things you'll have drilled into your head as a beginning beekeeper is feeding the bees. And it is important to help them establish. It's also important to help them prepare for winter because a lot of time these new colonies just don't get there on their own. We have several different feeders available, and we have several pictures of them here. And let me skip one frame ahead. Oh, come back. Let's talk about them. This here is what they call a division or a frame feeder. And I am not a fan of these for beginners because they require you to open up the hive and carefully pour your syrup into this little opening. And that's just prone to error. In commercial operations, they'll use these all over the place, but realize those commercial beekeepers have pumps and a fuel trigger hose they use to fill these things with. And they're not making the messes you would make with a pitcher in your apiary tripping over stuff. One of the things we have to watch out for, especially in the later half of the summer, is spilled syrup will cause robbing, which is a big problem to avoid. We don't want to spill syrup in the apiary at all. Now these two here, these are top feeders, and they're different styles. This is a raft style top feeder. This is one that came out of the Dadant catalog, but there's several others out there. And it has this raft that free floats on top of the syrup in it. And the nice thing about this style is it doesn't kill bees. You can feed, I think this holds about 4 gallons of feed, and that's a lot of feed. And the bees will climb up through the middle and step on down onto the rafts and access the syrup and go back about their way. You don't get drowning. That's the opposite of this, which is an insert style feeder. This thing has a wooden rim that's not in the picture. Actually, they're probably stacked over. Here's the wooden rims. And this sits inside there, and you fill this moat up with syrup, about 3 gallons or so. And the bees can come up through this space here. There's actually a raised lip inside of this. The bees can come up and then descend down to access the syrup. An issue is a lot of times, somehow, the bees get out in this space and they drown. And this thing will be full of dead bees when you go back to mess with it. So I really don't care for this style, but they are out there. One of the upsides about this style, it comes with that 3-inch wood rim that this sits in. Well, in the wintertime, you can take this out and use that 3-inch box as a feeder space or for dry sugar feeding in the wintertime. We have this thing here on the bottom right. This is a Boardman feeder or an entrance feeder. And the principle is pretty simple. You take a mason jar, fill it with syrup, put this lid on it that has these little perforations in it. And you can make these yourself using a frame nail or a 1/16 inch drill bit. Put these little holes in that lid, put it on the mason jar, invert the mason jar. What happens is the little air pocket in the mason jar creates a vacuum and doesn't let the syrup dump out. But the bees can access the syrup through the little holes in the bottom of the lid. I use these a lot in the springtime where I will take a hive, put an inner cover on the hive. And let me go back a few slides to look at an inner cover. You see how this inner cover has this hole in it? Well, a wide mason jar lid covers that hole just about perfectly. So I can open up a hive that has this inner cover on it, put one mason jar over this hole, and then I can put another box over this lid and put the outer cover on that, and it covers everything up. In the springtime, and really a lot of the time when I am feeding, I'm feeding to instigate brood rearing, and a 1-quart mason jar is the right size to do that. One of the downsides with these feeders is they have so much feed, you can flood the brood nest and clog it up, which can work against you. So sometimes a mason jar feeder on top of the hive is the best option. That said, these are a godsend if you're trying to get hives to wait before winter, especially if you have a bad fall flow, which we had last year in particular in 2021. Now, a word of warning about these feeders, this style, you can actually use this on top of a hive as well. Like just have a box with frames and an empty box on top of that and put this straight on top of the frames. You don't want to put this on the entrance of a hive, which is how they market it. The Boardman feeder on the front of the hive, while it's convenient, you can see how much fluid is in the thing. The downside is the robbers will find this jar and they will start robbing that hive. And you only feed hives that need feeding, i.e. weak hives. So they're generally not able to defend themselves from robbing. And this turns into a nightmare real fast. Do not use the Boardman feeders, the front mount style feeders on the front of a hive. I'm forgetting something. What am I forgetting? Oh, when feeding, there's a lot of products out there like Honeybee Healthy. And what they are is essential oils you can add to the syrup that's supposed to stimulate the bees eating. And I generally say don't use these. The reason being, again, we feed colonies that are growing that are inherently weak. Those feeds have a smell and it kind of acts like a dinner bell to other hives and it can promote robbing. The safest feed is the unscented feed, which is just plain sugar water in these feeders. The bees will find it and they will gorge on it. Do not worry about that. You don't need to add those essential oils to these feed products. I've seen hives getting robbed out in the spring when they're not supposed to do that because of those feed products. Now, what's some other things you will commonly encounter? Let's start on the right. These are slatted racks. I'm not a fan of these, but if you're on Facebook, you'll see Don Chesick talking these up all day long. And what these are is these racks. You'll notice that these frames, these styles of wood line up where the frames would be. What these are is you put these on the bottom of a hive. And if you have a surplus population, the bees will festoon off of these bars instead of hanging out the front of the hive. I don't use these. So in summertime, I have big beards on my hive. I have a lot of bees that hang out the front of my hives. Don does use these. He doesn't have that. So his bees are inside protected from the weather. Mine aren't. So when a freak spring style thunderstorm rolls through, I might have some bees get a little wet, but that's not a concern to me. On the left is something that causes great consternation amongst beginning beekeepers, and that is the queen excluder. Some beginning kits come with the queen excluder. The reality is, as a beginner, for the most part, you're just trying to get your hives to fill up their brood nest. In our region, I would recommend a double deep brood nest. So when you start out with that hive, that first year, your goal is just to get them to fill out that double deep as much as possible. With a queen excluder, we use that to keep the queen from going up and laying into honey supers. So that first year, you're probably not going to even touch your honey supers, so you don't need to screw with these things. Now, in later years, if you're trying to make honey in perfect frames, or if you're making comb honey, you will need a queen excluder. So when you put those boxes on top of your brood nest, the queen can't go up there and lay eggs in the frames that are above. That'll keep those honey frames just wax without the brood nest staining. And that's especially important if you're doing comb honey, because no one wants to bite into comb honey and hit a cocoon. It's not gonna be a fun experience. There are two different styles of queen excluder in general. There's metal and there's plastic. You'll also see wood bound metal, which is a higher version of this thing. On paper, these things are the same. Anecdotally, the bees pass through the metal better than they pass through plastic. The metal is going to have rounded edges because these are wire rods. The plastic has somewhat hard square edges to it, so it's a little bit more abrasive to the bees to pass. That said, the metal can get bent and you can have a queen get past it. Plastic doesn't bend like that. The plastic will break and shatter. It's easier to tell if you have a damaged plastic queen excluder. Some people take the queen excluder and cut holes out of the front of it. And the idea with that being is the worker bees learn where these holes are and they can pass through the queen excluder readily, because inside of the hive, the queen's going to usually be in this area. So she's not going to find these holes on the ends. It's imperfect, but it's one of those ideas that's out there that persists. So once again, queen excluder, first year beekeeper, you really don't need to mess with it. Just get your 2 deep boxes filled up. Don't worry about the rest of it. Common additional equipment. Now this is stuff for winter time. In the winter time, we need to be aware of condensation in the hive because condensation can cause trouble. In the wintertime, you'll have your cluster of bees eating, 40 pounds of honey. Well, that honey turns into vapor, water vapor, and has to go somewhere. If you don't have an insulating break between that cluster and the top of the hive, you can have condensation. When you have condensation inside the hive, it rains on the bees and that kills them in wintertime very quickly. So we want to avoid that situation. And there's kind of 2 different schools of thought for that in our area. I am a practitioner of the one on the right, the foam inner cover. Now, I don't have a fancy one from Better Bee. I just buy the sheet foam boards from the big box hardware store and cut them to the size of the top of the hive and put them on. Some people use 2-inch thick ones. I use the 5/8 inch thick one, which they sell as a 1/2 inch. It's actually 5/8. And all that is to give you just a little thermal break between the hot cluster and the cold lid of the hive. That's all it has to do. Now, some people use something far more exotic. This is a Vivaldi board or a quilt box. And what a Vivaldi board does is there's a screen on the bottom of this, and it's covered, in this case, in wood shavings. There's all sorts of different materials you can fill these with. So as the bees do their stuff, as they expire CO2 and water vapor, it rises up because it's hot and hits this medium. The medium will absorb some of the water, and it keeps most of the heat in the hive. The water that does get in this medium, because there's vent holes on the sides of this box that are at the top of the medium layer, air still passes through here. Air passes above the insulating layer and will pull the moisture out of that insulating layer. So what this will do is it keeps the bees warmer and takes the moisture somewhere. If you keep your bees warmer during wintertime, they're going to consume less honey and ultimately be better off entering the spring. Now, the downsides with these things, you're looking at $20 or $30 to put this thing together. This thing is just a few dollars. And I have 100 hives. I need to save pennies where I can, so I go with just the foam inner cover. I have to admit, I only did about half my hives with foam covers this year, and I didn't have any losses for it. What are some other oddball things we have? This here is, and this is also one, these are powder pollen substitute feeders. In the springtime, I will occasionally feed pollen substitute. If you're in an area that lacks late summer, fall foliage, and this is going to be in the urban areas where you don't have goldenrod or aster, this is going to be a bigger concern for you. A lot of times you can have trouble getting enough protein into these hives, enough pollen. And the workaround to that is feeding pollen substitute. In the springtime, we'll feed pollen patties, which are, sugar syrup and this pollen substitute. The pollen substitute is mostly soy, but there's other stuff in there. And the bees can eat that. Later in the year, we don't want to use those because of hive beetle problems. So we'll switch to a powder or a dry feed. And we can literally just throw that dry feed in these buckets, and they're protected enough from the rain, but the bees can access them from the front. You will want to place sticks on this stuff, otherwise the bees get in the pollen powder and they can't get back out. But that's what these are, is pollen feeders. You'll also see people make smaller versions of these out of like PVC pipe with gutter attachments, and those work fairly well. Also in this picture, we have this hive that's way up on a tree. This is a swarm trap. This thing will have a frame or two of drawn wax, and the rest of it will be starter frames in my instance. And what this does is this is an encouragement for bees that are swarming to move into it. So if I have a swarm in my apiary, with luck, and I don't find them, with luck, they'll move into this and I'll keep the bees. I will also, if I'm feeling squirrely enough that year, place these in areas in the woods, at friends' houses, etc., and use these to actually capture bees via swarming. And there's all sorts of classes available just on this process. On the right, we have a homemade wax melter. This is a solar melter. And a solar melter is great because it'll convert all of this into like a 2 by 3 by 1 inch block of wax. It really will reduce this stuff down. And you can use that wax for whatever you're going to use wax for, whether it be waxing future frames for more bees, or for making candles or lip balms or all that other stuff. And this is, believe it or not, just a plastic storage tote, a piece of galvanized sheet metal I had lying around that I bent into this ramp shape with a bread pan at the bottom to collect the drippings. And most of this wax, most of the trash will actually stay up here, all the goopy stuff, and the nice clean wax will run down and below. And this is just a window from a storm door I had replaced. So just a chunk of tempered glass on top that creates a solar oven. You can buy these as well, but homemade ones work fine. Now, if you buy a nuke, and I do recommend as a beginning beekeeper, you buy a nuke as opposed to a package. I also recommend you buy a nuke from someone in your area that's raising bees in your area that aren't shipping in bees. You're going to have a better product in general. These are plastic nuke boxes. And the reason why most beekeepers selling nukes will sell them in plastic is because this is a lot cheaper than my woodware. Just the wooden box, not including the bottoms or tops, costs as much as these boxes do. These were about $10. These were about 15. I'm sure it's closer to 15 to 20 at this point for these. The one on the left is what I call a Jester box. It's properly called an Easy Nuke, but it's made by the Jester Bee Corporation. And it's just that signboard material folded up to a nuke. And it has this hinged lid with a live hinge that closes down on it. And it has a little entrance on the end you can pop open. That one's actually opened up there. If you buy a nuke, talk to the guy you're getting the nuke from or girl you're getting the nuke from to see how these things work, just because they have little tricks to them. Same for this Pro Nuke thing. These Pro Nukes have sliding doors and sliding vent assemblies on them, which are pretty clever. Downsides though is these frames aren't really locked on this thing, so they kind of slop around unless you modify these. Instead, same for these. The frames can kind of slop around in here. The bees genuinely don't like living in these, so we don't like to keep bees in these long term, at least in my experience. And I know a guy that had big time losses in Pro Nukes because they were in the hot sun and they're just not as stable thermally, and they cooked a bunch of hives. So just things to be aware of. These are really just for temporary use in our experience. Here's some less common stuff you'll see, but it's out there enough to at least have a look at it. On the left, we have what's called a resource hive. And what this is, also notice the handles are cut strangely, don't know why. What this is this is a 10 frame box that has a divider in it, that has an entrance on this side, and this side is closed, but on the back it'll have an entrance. And on top of it has a 4 frame nuke and a 4 frame nuke. So what this actually is this side is an 8 frame hive, and this side is an 8 frame hive. And the upside to this setup is in wintertime, the bees will form a cluster around the dividing center of the hive. So even though you have 2 different colonies, they function like one colony for wintering. But in the springtime, you'll have 2 different queens. It is a bit more efficient way of wintering because they consume less resources. In our region, it's not quite as important. The big guy you'll see talk about this is Mike Palmer. He's up in Vermont where they have really severe winters, and that little bit of efficiency improved from having those 2 colonies next to each other does pay dividends in his part of the world. On the right, we have what's called a vented inner cover. And instead of having that closed inner cover or the inner cover with that little hole in it, this one's made of screen. And some people are a fan of these. This is actually a regular old inner cover that rotted out that I put screen on afterwards. It does increase the amount of airflow you have. I have a couple colonies that beard no matter how cool it is in the summertime. And I put these vented inner covers on to help them maintain their hive temperature how they like it to keep the bees inside. Because if the bees are outside, they're not working. And here's some other things that you will hear about. The thing on the right is called a Cloak Board. And what that does, you can put that between 2 different hive bodies two different brood nests, hive bodies. You can split a brood nest, is what I'm trying to say. And it has this queen excluder material on it. So when you split the brood nest, you can lock the queen downstairs, and then you can slide this thing in to isolate the box on top. And if you do that, the box on top thinks it's queenless and starts raising queens. And then a week later, you can pull this thing back out, and you can make really nice queens using this setup. But this isn't something for beginners, but you'll see it in the catalogs, which is why I have it here. And then we have this thing on the left, and this can do similar tricks too to help you with queen rearing. This is a double screen board. You'll also see this called a Snellgrove board, and it can be really handy for splitting a colony. You can actually do a vertical split where you take one colony and turn it into two colonies vertically. And it's kind of a neat trick, but it's really beyond the scope of what we're doing here. And let's also briefly talk about alternative hive styles. We're cruising towards an hour. We're doing okay. There's the long lang, top bar, Ware, Slovenian, and Lyons hives. This is a long langstrip. This is from a friend of mine named Rick Sullivan. And what a long langstrip does is it uses standard langstrip frames, but puts them in a longer hive. And the upside with this is you don't have hive bodies to move. The biggest thing you'll move at any one time is just a 10-pound frame. So if you're an older beekeeper, a beekeeper with back trouble, or maybe a small little lady, this might be a much better option for you because you're not moving those 90-pound or 50-pound boxes. You're just moving these individual frames. They are a bit more difficult to manage because, frankly, everything in the bee catalog is set up for vertical langstrip style hives, but these are a great option that are out there. Top bars. I actually started as a top bar beekeeper, and I love top bar hives because they're a bit more interactive and a bit more intuitive. What this is we have this half hexagon shaped hive body, and we put these bars across the top of it. You can see there's a sheet of bars that will go across the top of this. It makes the closed top side, and the bees will build these fantastic combs off of those top bars. That is a fantastic comb. I think they're really simple. This whole box I could build for about $60. It's probably $80 today. But when you're looking through the bee catalog, this is a triple deep hive for 60 or 80 bucks. That's a bargain compared to what you're going to have to spend for langstrip style equipment. And also, this is feasible to make on a table saw. I don't think anyone in their right mind would actually home make their own frames on a table saw, their own langstrip style frames. But these top bar frames are very achievable on a table saw. I'm a big fan of top bars. Actually, if you ever get comb honey from me, they're from top bars. Last, we have the Lion style, or second to lastly, we have a Lion style. A Lion style is more or less a langstrip frame that's been doubled in length. It's a very deep frame. There are fans and practitioners. Some people think the bees do better in this style of box. The reality is bees can thrive and get sick and die in any of these styles of boxes. So it really doesn't excuse us from beekeeping, management, inspections, healthcare, etc. Just something to be aware of. There is a style we don't mention here, which is the Ware and the Slovenian. We don't mention either of those. Slovenians are actually buildings that they install hives into, to where you'll have like 30 hives in a wall. Very uncommon in the States, but you'll see some pictures out of what would that be, Eastern Europe, that are fascinating. Those are Slovenian style hives. There's also the Ware, also called the People's Hive. And what a Ware is kind of a mashup between langstrip and top bar hives, to where you'll have, instead of the full-size frame, you'll have just a top bar in a Ware, but it's in a square box, and you manage them backwards. Instead of putting supers on top of the brood nests in a langstrip, in a Ware, you actually put naders, you put boxes underneath the brood nest to encourage the brood nest to drop down and fill the old brood frames with honey. Let me go back to where we were. Okay, beekeeping tools. There's a lot of stuff with beekeeping tools, and we'll go over most of them with the exception of the spring scale and oxalic guns. Let's see, do I have any more slides? Okay, we have that stuff. Let's go ahead and finish slides where we can. and then we'll go over to the stuff live video. This is my oxalic gun. And I'm kind of jumping to the last thing we're going to talk about equipment-wise. First, what this thing does is it allows me to take oxalic acid powder and create a very fine dust to treat for varroa mites. This is a really good practice to use something like this around Thanksgiving to really get your bees set up well for the next year. And this is something Leonard Davis will go over in his presentations. And to an extent, I will in my presentations too, later on. But this is my mite gun. Now you need heavy gloves because these things get hot. You also need a respirator mask, which isn't pictured in here. You also need splash goggles. The respirator mask would be a HEPA style, which is the pink cheeks. It is a cartridge-based mask we use with these because you're, again, making a very fine acid powder. You really don't want to inhale that. But just realize this is a great tool to have around Thanksgiving. They also make what I call a frying pan version of this, which is pretty much a very small frying pan on the end of a long stick. They put oxalic powder into and then insert it to a hive. Historically, these things were like $40 for the oxalic frying pan, and this gun was like $250. The frying pans are like $150 at this point in the Dadant catalogs, and the guns are cruising $400 and $500. As a beginner beekeeper, this is something to borrow from your mentor for that first year, just because they are such a big investment. See what you like out there. Go to meetings and see what other people in your area are using. So let's talk about beekeeping tools, and after that, PPE. So let's just go to the live feed for a while to finish things up. All right, there I am. Now, hive tools. Hive tools are just pry bars by another name. So let's look at a couple of the options that I have around. You'll notice also on the end of that list are screw shooter and ratchet strap. I use ratchet strap to hold my hives down because I've had incidents where it was high wind that come through that kind of bother me. But more importantly, I've had people knock my hives down with lawnmowers. And when that happens, if they're strapped together, the hive kind of falls back and stays intact. You don't kill bees. You don't have a bunch of bees come out. Conversely, I hit one in my own yard this year. It didn't have a ratchet strap. And when it hits the ground, it scatters everywhere. And it was, I think, a 4-box tall hive. Big hive, and I had bees everywhere. And if I wasn't wearing a bee jacket, I would have been in trouble at the time. So let's talk about hive tools. The most common one to see is like a 9.5-inch pry bar. And you can see this thing has seen some mileage. This is stainless. You will find carbon tools and stainless tools. Stainless tools don't rust, but they will shatter if you put too much force into them. So just be aware you can't be super willy-nilly with these things if you're a big guy. It has a nail puller that you'll never use, and basic pry tool ends. I always have one of these in my pocket in the apiary. The other thing I always have in my pocket is this. This is a J hook or a frame lifter hook, or a Chinese tool, you'll see call that. And the big perk, it has this thing on it. And what you can do in the hive is if you have these frames together, you can sneak this thing in there and do this number with it and use that to pull the frame out. And that can be a real handy tool, especially in some tight hives. I usually have a mud knife or a 4-inch drywall knife for getting stuff out of the hive. I haven't used one in a long time, but I used to carry one. Now this here is a handy tool, especially for people with weaker fingers. This is a frame grabbing tool. So in the hive, again, if you're having a hard time getting your fingers in there like that J tool, what you can do with this is it grabs onto this frame top bar very robustly, and you can pull it out using this thing. This might be a real godsend for you, especially if you have something like rheumatoid arthritis or just weak hands on the whole, because you can get a really strong grip on this, even with big old clunky gloves on. And there are very different versions of these. I would recommend the simplest one you can find that should have a spring in it. This one lost its spring over the years, but this is a really handy tool for those instances. What else do we have to go over? Queen cages. Now, if you get a queen or if you're installing a package, you're going to have to deal with a queen cage most likely. The most common queen cage you'll encounter is this thing. This is a Benson cage or a 3-hole cage. And what this will usually have is 2 of these holes will be clear. They'll have a queen and her attendants in it, and the bottom will have a wad of candy in it. And the way you install these is you can stick them in the hive. More commonly, you have to put use a staple or a paper clip or something to suspend this thing, because you're usually doing this in a hive, there's no wax in it. And you'll suspend it with the candy side down. You'll wait 3 days, check, see if the bees are accepting the queen. If they're accepting the queen, you remove the plug on the candy side in. These will often have a little cork plug in the bottom of them. You remove the cork on the candy side in, put it back in, wait 3 more days, check. And you're checking to see if the queen got out, because sometimes the candy's too hard for them to get past. When the candy's too hard, then you'd release them from the other side. That's one style. This is the most common style of queen cage you'll encounter. If you deal with Kentucky queen breeders, you're going to encounter these things. This is a California cage, just a much smaller version. And these can have a candy tube, which is just this little chunk of plastic. They'll have a piece of fondant in it, and it does the same thing that Benson cage does. And lastly, you might encounter this goofy thing. This is a JZBZ cage, and it kind of clicks shut with the queen inside, like so. And the way you would deal with this in a hive, the way I prefer to do it, is you can take a toothpick through these holes in the bottom and hang it between some frames, and the candy plugs at the bottom that way. This is often filled with candy, and quite often if you get a queen shipped in, it won't even have that cap on it, just have a candy plug in it. And that's how you would install it near the brood nest in your hive. So that's queen cages. There's also another style, a clamp style queen cage. That can be made out of plastic or metal. The plastic is clear and tends to be brittle and shatters. The metal tends to bend, and when it bends, the queen can escape. So I don't use either of them, but they are commonly out there. I often use this thing instead as a temporary queen cage. And this is a homemade marking tool, which is just a prescription bottle with screen on the end and this foam plunger. And I can keep a queen in there in my pocket while I'm doing something else. And this doesn't get deformed or break in a way that I can't tell if it's broken. So that's one thing out there. And along with that marking cage, there's a marking pin. And this is just a simple paint pin that you can get at the Walmart. These work very well. They're water-based. Let's see. That was queen cages, smokers. One tool you'll use the heck out of is smokers. And I have 2 different examples here. One is a cheapo from the internet. One is a proper Dadant smoker. My go-to smoker is actually a MannLake round top with a plastic bellows, because the plastic bellows don't have these sharp edges on them, so they're a bit nicer to handle. Now, one of the big differences between these 2 smokers is the one on my right, which would be to your left, has this. It has this cage around it. These smokers get really hot, so that cage keeps you from burning your fingers as readily on this thing. And I'd recommend a cage smoker over a naked smoker any day of the week. Both of these will have at the bottom, I'm not even sure if this will show up, but there's a grated structure there in the bottom. Oh, I'm not even seeing it in the picture. Anyway, down here, there's a piece of metal that has holes stamped in it. And what that piece of metal does, it gives an airspace at the bottom of the smoker. Because when you squeeze this, which is the bellows, it pushes air from here into this space. So we want that air to be able to get into the bottom of this chamber. You can actually see how the heat line on this thing is above that little spacer at the bottom. Your smoker needs that spacer in it to help it work right. I will stuff these with pine needles myself, but there's all sorts of different fuels out there available to light these smokers with. And we'll do a video on how to light a smoker separately, because it is that important of a skill set. But spend some decent money on a smoker. You're gonna spend a lot of time with that smoker. Figure out how to use it. Let's see. Let's talk about some management tools briefly. We talked about mouse guards. This is my version of a mouse guard. This is just 1/2-inch hardware cloth built into an L shape. And I use a common handheld staple gun to affix this to the hive. And these I'll install, it's actually, I'm shooting this in September. I'll be installing these towards the end of this month to keep mice from entering that hive during the cluster times. I commonly also carry a spring scale. And a spring scale is just a luggage scale. and I'll actually weigh hives through the winter time to make sure they have enough honey on them. That way, I'm not just lugging hives guessing how much they weigh. I know how much they weigh and if they need more feed or not. Next on my list is the Varroa Easy Wash. This is an important tool. It's actually a more modern one in the beekeeping kit. Let me finish my coffee off. This thing. This is a whole kit. What it is, from the dollar store, a little dish tote with rounded edges. Let's see how it's rounded. And a little scoop. And what I can do with this is I can shake bees into this and scoop up a half cup of bees really easily and insert them into this, the Varroa Easy Wash. I use a name brand Easy Wash. There are homemade versions of this, and there's finally some competitor models on the market. But what this is, as I lose the lid, is a wash vessel. So you can put bees in this wash vessel, put them in this thing, which will be filled with isopropanol, rubbing alcohol, put that lid on it, and you can shake them. The instructions say for a minute, I do half a minute. And afterwards, the varroa mites that were on your bees, which you'll learn about in the coming sessions, will end up in the bottom where you can count them. And this is useful for making decisions on treatments for hives for varroa control, which is a huge chunk of beekeeping management today. This lets you make real informed decisions and not blind decisions based on seasonality, which is a big improvement in keeping hives alive and through winter. One thing I don't have an example of is a ledger. Some people like to have a book where they keep all their notes on their hives. There's commercially made ones available. There's people that just make a spreadsheet with the information they want to record and print that out. I personally scribble notes on top of the hive with the paint pen. This is a problem. There's the white paint pen years for queen marking, so I carry a black paint pen for that time. But I will write my notes straight on the hive, in part because 100 hives, ledger is going to be really difficult to parse what it means. Let's see what else we have here. Test kits. I don't have an example of these, but you'll find them in the catalog. And basically what these test kits do for certain diseases, for certain bad diseases, namely American foul brood, it gives you a way to positively identify a disease outbreak. And it functions similar to a pregnancy test. You take a sample, you put it on there, and you wait for an image to develop on it. They do have a short shelf life, but they are available through the big bee companies, and in many cases they're recommended. I myself can generally identify disease without using a test kit, so I don't bother with them at this point. But for a beginner, that might be more important. And we already talked about oxalic guns and pans. Well, my slideshow stopped. There we go. And let's go on to personal protective equipment. Now, I do have a slide I want to share about beekeeping. Let's see if it works. There we go. The reality is, with beekeeping, you're going to spend a lot of time putting boxes together and doing woodwork. And you'll notice the guy in the picture, he's got his eye protection on and his hearing protection. And he really should be using a push block because he's running a table saw. These are just things to be aware of. Wear the proper PPE. And if you're building boxes, wear the proper PPE for that. Now, a lot of beginners will buy this thing as their first bee suit. And it's a horrible choice for a first bee suit. I will use these on occasion in my apiary. I've bred my bees for being docile. I know what my hives are up to when I'm wearing one of these. But the most common thing I will wear is actually a jacket. And I'm a big fan of beekeeping jackets. There are a lot of different versions of jacket that are available. I would recommend going ahead and taking the time to buy a ventilated jacket. And that's what this is an example of here. This is just a standard jacket. And what you would do with this is wear jeans. Wear like some heavy jeans because the bees won't really generally get you through some heavy work pants. And anytime you can use lesser equipment, you're better off because the full-size bodysuits they're out there, they're available, and they work well. but it requires buying a full-size bodysuit versus a jacket. These go on easily and fast, and they're pretty effective. This is a fencing style jacket as opposed to the hat style. I prefer the fencing style because I have a big head, and this works for me. If you have a big head or a small head, those hats won't be sized right for you. If you have a big head, the hat's going to sit up here. If you have a small head, the hat's going to sit down here. So a veil covers you either way. Now, I would recommend generally going ahead and spilling the beans for a vented jacket. When we do beekeeping, a lot of time it's during horribly hot times of year in the sun, and that's part of why these are white, is that you're in the sun. But this ventilated jacket is going to give you a little bit of relief when the wind blows. I admittedly have an old MannLake solid jacket, and I actually use that for cutting the grass because the grass won't get into these little pockets and nooks and crannies. There are downsides to a ventilated jacket versus a solid jacket. Again, the nooks and crannies this thing has. This is also a lot heavier because a solid jacket is just going to be the basic material. These vented jackets have these foam layers that create the actual space between the bee and you so you don't get stung through the jacket. So these are actually a heavier jacket. In the springtime, I'll wear that old solid jacket because it's lighter. Other things to be aware of when buying these things. This one's a Dadant. Don't take that as a promotion. They're just one of several manufacturers out there, and they all have their own different brands. I remember what my bee suit is. Is it a Provent? I'll put it in the comments what my bee suit is. I don't remember at the moment. But one of the things is these veils. These veils are delicate. And they're usually the first thing that gets damaged on a bee suit. So having replacement veils available might be something for you to look at or be aware of. This is a Dadant jacket. Dadant does sell replacement veils for their non-vented jackets. So if you damage this veil, to replace this veil, you need to buy a new jacket. The reason why I say they sell them for their non-vented jackets, the zippers are set up differently on their non-vented jackets, and replacement veils are for those. So just something to be aware of. I'll put a comment up with the video that says what my jacket is because I can't remember the brand at the moment. You can buy a jumpsuit instead of a jacket as well. Jumpsuits, again, heavier, but like if you have a vented jumpsuit in the summertime, you can be wearing basketball shorts under there, which will be a lot cooler than the jeans I'm wearing generally. Let's talk about gloves. Beekeeping gloves in the catalog are these long things that go all the way back and up to your elbow. And the reality is that's kind of more thought for the guy that's just wearing the helmet. You really don't need that long thing for wearing a bee jacket because you're just going to end up doubling your layers up, and it gets really clumsy and awkward. If I'm wearing leather gloves, what I will tend to do, let me put that on the ground before I damage the desk, is just common old full leather work glove from the hardware store. These are a lot shorter, so when I pull them on, they don't go all the way back this way, but they have enough of a gauntlet for me to get my sleeve over. So you want to make sure you have a decent sleeve on your bee jacket if you're using a short glove like this. But this is a lot easier to put on, and these are a lot cheaper coming from the hardware store than from the bee catalog. Now, I'll wear the leathers if I'm doing something fast or if the bees are mean that day, like if there's bad weather. I will frequently work barehanded with my bees, but again, I've bred for docility and I've done bees for quite a bit. If I'm getting into sick hives, or if I'm getting into an unknown apiary, or if I just want enough protection for that day, I'll wear nitrile gloves. These ones in particular are 3.5 mil. One thing I will say about buying nitrile or latex gloves, don't get them at the hardware store. The ones at the hardware store are thin and cheap and tear. Get them from a medical supplier like these ones. The 3.5s are about the lightest you can wear in a hive and have survived. I've tried to use 2.5 mil gloves, and the reality is the frames are coarse enough it tears those gloves up. So 3.5 is kind of the minimum. I've also used 5.5 and 8.5. The heavier gloves, the less likely you're going to get stung through them, but they get clumsier. And there's people even wear chemical gloves and dishwashing gloves that get towards the 11 or 12 mil range. Reality with these, as long as I'm not pinching the bees, I'm not going to get stung with these, is my experience. We did mention mite control. I mentioned while looking at that oxalic gun, you need to have a mask and wear thermal gloves. There's some other mite treatment products that also require the use of masks and gloves, like Mite Away Quick Strips and formic acid products. They produce a very nasty formic acid gas, formic acid vapor. And these gloves will actually fall apart if you're applying the strips with them. So you actually need a chemical glove when installing those. You also would want an acid vapor mask, which I believe are, they're either purple or green cartridges. I forget which, I'd have to check. But you would want an acid vapor mask for using formic acids. I personally actually just use the dirty diaper technique of keeping it at arm's length and making sure I'm not breathing the vapors off of them. You also want to splash goggles for oxalic acid, some of those other products. Splash goggles are the ones that go around the face and have the little control vents on them to keep liquids from getting in. Lastly, let's talk about suppliers in our area. There are the big guys. In Kentucky, we're blessed to have both Dadant and MannLake distributors here. MannLake's in Clarkson, Kentucky, which is about an hour and a half south of Louisville, and Dadant's in Frankfort, which is about an hour east of Louisville. But there's also several regional suppliers. There's Honey Bee Connection in Moorhead, Kentucky, which is in the Appalachian area. There's Pete Zook, which is down near Bowling Green. There's Blue Sky Bee Supply, which is in Ravinia, Ohio. And they're all close enough to work with. I've been using a guy named Toba in Campbellsburg, Indiana for my wooden equipment because he makes very nice equipment. So there's various suppliers that are out there. And with that, that kind of wraps up our equipment presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in comments to this video and we will answer them as we can. And I thank you for your time this day.